Of the 28 parables that are taught by Jesus in the New Testament, and even of the 24 that are unique to the, or that are recorded in the book of Luke, not unique, 18 of them are unique to Luke, but of the 24 that are in the book of Luke, arguably two of the most famous, well-known, maybe even most beloved of all those parables are found right here in Luke chapter 15, where we spent last night looking at the parable of the lost sheep. The 99 are safe, the one goes astray, the good shepherd goes and finds it. And then the other, one of the most well-known, right here in Luke 15 is what we're going to be looking at tonight, which is the prodigal son. I realized last night, for some reason last night I said Wednesday night. You have to forgive me. We're doing VBS at Pleasant Valley where I preach right now as well in the mornings. So when we get done here, we go to Mom and Daddy's house and go to bed and then get up about 6 and get ready and drive to Killen and do VBS down there till noon, and then we come back up here. So my days are a little confused. And we started on Sunday night here and started yesterday there, and we go through Wednesday night here and we end on Thursday there. So I'm a little mixed up on the days. So we're looking at the prodigal son story tonight, and something that you might find interesting, if you pay close attention to the prodigal son story, the word prodigal is never used in the story. That word doesn't come from our text. And yet, I think you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who doesn't know this story as the story of the prodigal son. So where and why is it called the prodigal son story, or the parable of the prodigal son? That actually comes to us from the 4th century. It's going to be about 400 years, roughly, after this parable was told by Jesus and written down by Luke. A fellow by the name of Jerome, who was a Catholic theologian, was tasked with taking and translating the New Testament books into Latin, which was the academic language of the day. That was the prevailing language of the priests and the scholars. So he was tasked with taking the Greek New Testament and translating it into Latin. And if you remember from your high school history class, you probably know the name of that Bible. It's called the Latin Vulgate. It's one of the most famous translations even to this day. And it was when he did that translation and he got to this text in Luke 15 that he put a heading over this section, over this particular story. And the heading that he inscribed was the penance and the prodigal sons. The penitent and the prodigal sons. Now that was roughly 1,600 years ago. And just to show you how influential that kind of stuff can be, we still call it the prodigal son, even though that word is nowhere found in our text. And part of the problem that we have in understanding this story, I've said over and over, why are we studying as adults these stories that we learned as children that seem to be on the surface really simple and easy? Case joked about my class time being shorter. Said, well, how much time do you need to say? The son goes astray and then he comes back home and the father forgives him. And the lesson is that no matter how far we stray from God, that if we'll come back home, God will always receive us back. And I don't want to imply that that's not a lesson we can learn from the story. We certainly can, and we absolutely should teach that lesson. There are a lot of people, myself included, who found their way back to the Father because of the promise of hope, of forgiveness in that story. So I don't by any means want to erase that. I just want to suggest that those of us who already know that story and have heard that story since we were children, we want to dig a little deeper because there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye. And it starts with this word prodigal. Whenever we use the word prodigal today, whenever me and you are talking, whether we're talking about the religion or we're talking about pop culture or just kind of teasing each other, whenever we use the word prodigal, we don't actually use the word correctly, the way that the word prodigal is defined. We use the word prodigal the way the story in Luke 15 is told. What do I mean by that? The word prodigal actually just means wasteful. That's what the word means. Now, that's not how we use it, is it? When we think about the prodigal son, we think about the son who goes away from his father. He goes out into the world. He lives this wicked, immoral life. He's, drinking and, sins of the flesh and who knows what else. And he's living this grossly immoral life. Bar rooms and brothels. And then one day he comes to himself and realizes this is foolish, and he decides that he wants to go back home. And he goes back home and he finds himself back in the good graces of his father. And so when we talk about prodigal, that's kind of how we use that word. We refer to somebody who maybe goes off the path and then they come back as the prodigal son comes home. There's a great bluegrass song by a band called New Tradition. I don't think they're a band anymore. And they have a song called Prodigal Son. And it tells the story of a man who's asking someone to write a letter to his parents for him. And the reason he says, because I never learned how to write. And so he says, started out, "Dear Mama, I know it's been a long time. I know I should have written you, but times have been tough. I've been working hard, putting back a little money, and I'm going to come and see you and Daddy as soon as I've saved enough. I bought a little farm, about 35 acres. I've been working my fingers right down to the bone. I met a little girl. Her name is Carrie April. We're going to get married this summer and build a home." And then the chorus of the song says, "Mama, don't you worry about your prodigal son. He's doing all right. He's going to rest when his day is done." One of these days now pray it won't be long, you'll look up and see your prodigal son's coming. That's pretty much how we use that term prodigal, right? Someone who goes away, goes astray, leaves what they were raised with, and then one day they come back to it. Now, that is the plot of the story. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that's not what the word prodigal means. The word prodigal means wasteful. Now, here's why that's important. Here's why it's important that right up front we define where this idea of prodigal son came into our understanding and what this word actually means. We need to know that so that we don't miss what his sin actually is. His sin is probably not what we think it is. His sin is not leaving his father's house. His sin is not asking for his inheritance before the time would come that he would get it, before his father would die and then he would get the portion that is his. His sin may not even be wicked living, immoral living, or at least immoral living as we define it, as we think of it. If you pay close attention to the story, his sin is actually his wastefulness of the abundance with which he has been entrusted. That's what he does. That's what it is to be prodigal, to be wasteful. He's had a tremendous blessing placed within his hands, and what does he do with it? He just wastes it like it's worthless. Now, why am I telling you that? Because when we assume that this man, his sin is doing these terribly wicked things, that he's out practicing this egregious immorality, when we assume that, and by the way, do you know why we assume that? I think there's two reasons why we assume it. One of them is because his older brother at the end of the story is going to make an accusation against him and say that he has been out wasting his inheritance with prostitutes. Now, I want to suggest something to you. Just because the Bible records that the older brother says it doesn't make it true. In fact, all the accusations that the older brother levels at his own father in the story are not true. The father rebuts them and says, "Son, that's not the way things are. Everything that I have is yours. It's all yours to do with as you please." What I want to suggest to you is this older brother is actually slandering his younger brother out of disgust for what he believes is preferential treatment by wasteful action of his brother. Now, here's one of the reasons I suggest that. How does this older brother know what his younger brother has been doing when he doesn't even know that his younger brother has come home? And he supposedly knows what his brother's been off doing in the foreground. Let me just pause right here and ask you this. Do we ever do that? Do we ever go ahead and kind of in our mind create a narrative for other people about what they're doing and what they're thinking and what their goals are? And we just have this list of all these egregious sins that they're guilty of. And we may not even be in a position to judge righteously or accurately about what's actually happening in their life. I believe there's some caution about that too, isn't it? Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And so when we read this story and we assume that just because this older brother says that he's doing all of this awful, awful stuff, it automatically makes us read this story in a certain way. And I believe there's a second reason why as well. And if you look in Luke 15 with me, a certain man, verse 11, had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance. There's our word prodigal if we're looking for it. There wasted, prodigal. There's our word. There wasted his substance. Here's the word I think that trips us up. The King James translation wasted his substance with riotous living. And so we read that word coupled with the slanderous accusation of the older brother, and we've got a pretty clear picture painted in our minds of what this boy was out doing. But I want to caution you something. The word translated riotous here is the same word that is translated gluttonous in other places in the Bible. What does gluttony mean? We ought to know that definition because every one of us practice it on a regular basis, likely, whether it's with food or finances or social media, television, golf, fishing, whatever our recreation of entertainment of choice may be. The idea of gluttony is the idea of using up more than you need. And so when you read that he wasted his substance in riotous living, I don't want you to necessarily just presume. Now, maybe he is in the bars and brothels. Maybe he is. All I'm saying is you don't know that. You assume that. You project that onto him. But here's what we know from the text. He was living beyond his means. Now, go ahead and squirm if you need to, but do we ever live beyond our means? Statistically speaking, 8 out of every 10 Americans people who live in what is pretty much universally accepted, the most prosperous society in the world. I know that there may be exceptions. Some of you who are older, you might be the exception to the rule, and I understand that. But for the most part, I'm not going to be talking to you. I'm talking to those of us who didn't grow up in the Depression era. Or maybe didn't grow up children of sharecroppers. Some of you probably did, but most of us didn't. Probably most everybody in this room, we've never known a night of actual hunger. When I say hunger, I mean that we did not have access to food. You might have got sent to bed without supper because you acted up, or you might not have eaten because you didn't like what they had. But it wasn't because there's nothing in the pantry. The cupboard is bare. Not only do we not go to bed hungry, I would say that for most of us, we seldom have to eat a meal that is not of our personal preference and choosing. Now, some of you I know remember a time on Monday you had beans and taters, right? And then on Tuesday you had taters and beans, just to mix it up. For the most part, for most people, that's ancient history. We pick what we want to eat. And we have an abundance of it. And I'm not trying to be silly or crass or ugly, because I certainly fall in this category, and I can't hide that standing up in front of you. Our waistline reveals that. We're going to be the first generation in the world to die prematurely because of excess rather than scarcity. And yet, 8 out of 10 of us, statistically speaking, are carrying debt that is not related to survival. I'm not talking about like a house or something or a car to drive. I'm talking about credit card debt and all sorts of debt of excess. And so again, I want to ask you a question. Are we ever guilty of living beyond our means? I would argue that living beyond our means is the American way. There's nothing more American right now than living beyond our means. Now, why am I telling you this? If we're not careful, we'll sit and we'll read this story, and we'll sit in our churches and we'll think to ourselves, I've never done any of that wild and shameful stuff like that younger son in the story. I haven't been out carousing in the bars and the brothels and all of the... I haven't lived that life. Or maybe you have, but you go, I don't live that life anymore. So we think this story really doesn't have any application for us. And I want to tell you that nothing could be farther from the truth. In so many ways, you and I are the younger son that is wasting what has been given to us in gluttonous living. The only reason anybody on planet Earth does not have enough is because somebody else is taking too much. There's plenty of resources to go around for all of us, unless some of us take more than we need. Now, I know it's a lot more fun to study this story the old way because it leaves me unscathed. But I'm going to presume that if you come here on a Tuesday night of your own volition, that you don't want to come here just to be patted on the head and told, good boy or good girl, keep up the good work. You want to be challenged and confronted with the Word of God so that it can search out your heart, find the things in your heart that are not in line with the way of Jesus, so that you can begin the work with Jesus of correcting those things. The process of transformation, what the New Testament refers to as sanctification. We have been blessed with so much time, money, food, opportunity, talents, all of these things. And so as we read this story of this young man, the question that we should challenge ourselves with, am I being wasteful? And if the answer is yes, then I am the prodigal son. I can be prodigal right here, right in this building, never having departed from the Father. And that's what we miss when we leave this story as the little children's Sunday school story that we often teach it as. The story begins with this statement, a certain man had 2 sons. I told you the other night, whenever you're reading the parables, especially the parables, but honestly, any story of Jesus, you really should do this. Read it against the backdrop of the Old Testament. As you read it, let your mind float back to what you know from the Hebrew Bible and ask yourself some questions. What stories in the Old Testament might play into this? Might inform me to what's being said here, or the direction it's being sent in, or the direction that it's wanting me to look in. And so when you read a certain man had 2 sons, I don't want us to read this story tonight like 21st century American Christians. I want us to do the best that we can to hear this story as if we were first century Jews hearing a Jewish rabbi tell this story. Because that gets us closer to the heart of what Jesus is trying to convey. And so, if you're sitting there and you hear this Jewish rabbi say, a certain man had 2 sons, probably the first thing you're going to pop into your mind is, I know a bunch of stories about a man that had 2 sons. You don't get past page 4 of the Bible before you encounter that story. Adam had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. You get to chapter 12, you're going to be introduced to Abraham, and very shortly thereafter, he's going to have 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac is going to grow up, and he's going to have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is going to grow up, and he's going to have a whole bunch of sons, but one of those sons, Joseph, is going to be sent off, and so there's going to be this weird story about Ephraim and Manasseh. And there's going to be kind of this mix-up of who gets the blessing. You know, they're going to say, hey, you're putting your hand on the wrong one. He said, no, I know what I'm doing here. When you hear those Old Testament stories about a certain man having 2 sons, almost without fail, in the story, the younger son is the good guy. The younger son is the chosen one. The younger son is the blessed one. Cain and his younger brother Abel, whose sacrifice was accepted. Ishmael and his younger half-brother Isaac, which one was the child of promise? Jacob and his older twin brother Esau, who was the one who was given the blessing? And so when we hear a certain man has 2 sons and we read about the younger one, we go, okay, we already know where this is. The younger one's going to be the good guy. He's going to be the blessed son. But we get a curveball right away because he takes what's given to him and he goes away and he wastes everything that he's been given. See, that sounds more like Esau, doesn't it? Esau, as the firstborn, would receive the double portion of the inheritance. He comes in from hunting one day and he didn't have any success. He's hungry. He's an impulsive person. And his impulsiveness is what leads to his wastefulness. Why do you think stores try to hit you with this? Today only, 25% off. Apply now. They want you to react impulsively, right? What do you have at the register of every store? Impulse products, right? You came to get groceries, but on your way out, you can't resist a pack of gum and some kind of little light that you're going to put on your the flip down for your car, the sun visor of your car. Here's some air freshener. You didn't come in for any of that stuff, but they know that they can play to your impulses and you'll be wasteful. By the way, if you'll pay attention, all the the candy and the toys and all that stuff that are at the aisles, where are they? Are they here or are they here? They put them down at eye level for 5-year-olds, don't they? Because they know you're going to get this. Mama, can I have this? Mama, can I have that? So they put certain stuff intentionally down there where they see it, and they put the stuff like Advil and Aleve up here where me and you can see it, because they know that's what we're going to need on an impulse. And so he comes in and he says, can I have some of that soup? And his brother says, yeah, if you'll give me your birthright. Think about what Esau is born with, what is handed to him just because he was born first. The double portion of the inheritance. And when the father dies, he'll be in the position of authority to oversee the estate and the family. He'll take over the family business and be the head of it. Those are incredibly valuable blessings that you're just going to be handed because you were first. And yet, in a moment of impulse, he says, what good is any of that if I starve to death? Now, is there anybody in here that literally believes that Esau was at the point of famine to death? No. but he was impulsive, and he wasted this valuable, valuable blessing. See, he's the older brother. And so all these stories we know, the younger brother's usually the good guy. He's the chosen one. He's the one of promise. He's the one that's received and accepted. And so here we have this younger brother, and he's given everything. And so we kind of just assume as we're hearing it, he's going to do good with it. And we go, wait a minute. He leaves and he goes and he wastes all of it. We don't see that coming. But of course the story's not over yet either. He receives enough to sustain himself for quite a while, and yet he winds up with nothing. Famines don't just happen overnight. If a famine were to begin right now, we wouldn't feel the effects of it for a little while. And even once it started, he should have enough to be able to endure. Again, think about another story of a young son, Joseph. He's the one who knows that the famine is coming, and they prepare for it so that they have enough to ride it out. This young man should not wind up in the position he is in. He has the resources to avoid it. Everybody's not going to, but he has the resources to avoid it, and yet he squanders it, and that is part of his great sin. He's living beyond his means. Now, what that results in is a tremendous level of destitution. And it's indicated in three ways in the text. Verse 14, when he spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Number one, we know how destitute he is because he doesn't have any community to take care of him, to help him. No family, no clan, no tribe. All of that stuff that we read in the Old Testament, that sometimes on our daily Bible reading, there's the sections that kind of get a little boring, a little tedious when there's these big long lists and all these genealogies and all these names. And it's very repetitive. Okay, so here's the tribe of Benjamin, and then it lists all these people, and this is the land that they get. And then, okay, now here's the tribe of Reuben, and here's all their people and all. It's not real funny, but it was very important to them because it's a hierarchy of protection. It was their version of a social safety net. So that if misfortune befalls you, that's okay. You have a family that can help you. What if misfortune befalls your family? That's okay. You likely have a clan, which is a more extended family. Kind of like the people you only see at that once every 10-year family reunion where, everybody gets together from all the different states. You don't really know them, but they're your kinfolk. Well, what if misfortune befalls them? That's okay. You got a tribe that you belong to, and they're not going to turn their back on you. Well, what about your tribe? Well, listen. Even if misfortune befalls your tribe, you belong to a nation, the nation of Israel, this big family that you're going to have protection, safety net, so that if you fall, you don't have to fall far, you get caught. And if you want a great, great example of this being put into practice, just read the book of Ruth. There's a fellow by the name of Elimelech. He has a wife by the name of Naomi. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They married two women who are Moabites. One of them is the name Orpah, and the other is named Ruth. A famine happens in the land of Canaan. So what do? They go to the land of Moab to try to ride it out. And in the land of Moab, Mahlon, Chilion, and Elimelech all die. And so all that's left now are the women. They don't have anybody to protect them there. And so what does Naomi say to the girls? I don't have any more sons. And if I had sons today, it wouldn't make sense for you to wait around until they grew up. Go back home to your people. Safety net. If you stay with me, you're going to starve to death. Orpah goes. Of course, Ruth does, and that's where we get that one of the most amazing pledges that we'll ever read anywhere in our Bible. Where you go, I'll go. Where your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. And so they go back to Canaan. And when they get back to Canaan, She goes back to the land of her nativity. And how do they survive when they have nothing? They go and they glean from the field of a near kinsman by the name of Boaz. You see what I'm saying? Immediate family, clan, tribe, safety net. He has none of that. For a Jewish person to hear that, it would be the most heartbreaking thing. This boy doesn't have anybody that cares about him. Second example of his destitution. He went and he joined himself to a citizen of that country. That is code for a Gentile, a non-Jew, in other words. So the second level of his destitution, this word joined himself, we would use the word today, glued himself to. I don't think it's a stretch to use a word like leech or parasite. He's having to attach himself to a Gentile just to be able to survive because he doesn't have any Jewish safety net. He left all that behind. Third level of destitution. He sent him into his fields to feed swine, and he would fain have filled his belly with the husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. The third level of his destitution is that he longs to trade places with the pigs because the pigs have somebody who feeds them every day. This boy left with enough to last a lifetime. And now he doesn't even have enough to make it through a day. Interestingly enough, remember we talked last night, Luke did not write chapter 14, chapter 15, chapter 16. He just wrote this account. And if we remove the chapter divisions, and if we were reading this, especially in the original language, there would be some things that would jump out to us real quick, because when we get over into chapter 16 and we're told another story about a poor beggar by the name of Lazarus, the exact same words that are used to describe Lazarus are being used here to describe this younger son. This beggar who's just wanting the table scraps. And of course, you know how the story ends. He comes back home and he gets restored. He gets a new robe. He gets a new ring. He gets new shoes. And all of those are emblematic. The robe that would be put on him would be the robe that his father would wear on special occasions. When they had a banquet or something like that, this would be the robe that he would wear. It's kind of like the host or guest of honor robe. And he put shoes on his feet, and the reason that's important is because slaves did not wear shoes. So he's making it clear that this is not a slave, this is a son. And putting the ring on his finger, the ring would be the signet where they would make the family crest. They would press it into the hot wax as a seal. And so in essence, what he is given then is power of attorney to do business in his father's name. But since I've already ruined this parable, let me ruin it a little bit more. What you and I hear in these verses in between. 17, when he came to himself. He said, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say again unto him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." And then you know how the story goes from there. We read that as contrition on the part of the son. Repentance on the part of the son. We read that as this boy finally has his come to Jesus moment. What am I doing? I'm sorry for what I've done. I've sinned. I want to go back to my father. I want to be forgiven. And it's fine to read it that way. I'm just telling you, I don't believe Jesus' audience would have heard it that way. They wouldn't have heard contrition and repentance. And I don't think we should either if we'll pay attention to the book of Luke. If you're a Jewish person and you're hearing this story, and you're hearing how things have befallen this boy, and you're hearing him make this speech that he rehearses about, I have sinned and I'm no more worthy, chances are you're going to hear the story of Pharaoh and Achan and Balaam, King Saul, all of whom, by the way, found themselves in desperate situations because of their turning away from the teaching, the guidance of God. And in their destitution, they cry out, I have sinned. Not because they're penitent, but because they just want to get out of the mess that they're in. Read it against the backdrop of the Old Testament stories. And if that's not good enough for you, read it against the rest of the book of Luke. If you've read the book of Luke, then already by this point you've read Luke chapter 12, which is the parable of the rich fool. And if you'll recall, he has this bumper crop, and as he looks at his abundance, you know what he does? He rehearses a speech in his mind, what we would call an internal monologue. He says to himself. If you keep reading in the book of Luke, you're going to get to chapter 16. The parable of the dishonest manager who is going to disobey his master, and when accountability comes, he rehearses a speech that he can say to his master to get him out of the mess that he's got himself in. And if you keep reading, you'll get to chapter 18 and the parable of the unjust judge who's got this woman who's driving him crazy, and he says to himself, if I don't give her what she wants, she's never going to leave me alone. And so I want to suggest to you that in the book of Luke, when someone has an internal monologue and says to themselves, here's what I'll do, we're not meant to read that as repentance, because this would be the only one of the four who is a good guy, quote unquote, in the story. The rich man who tears down his barns and builds bigger, he's called a fool. The other servant in 16, he's called dishonest. And the judge in chapter 18 is called unjust. And so I think that we're meant to read this story and understand that what he's saying is, if I'll go home and tell Daddy I'm sorry, then I can get back everything that I threw away. But I think it goes deeper than that. This is where translation limitations sometimes cause us to miss stuff. He uses a very specific word when he says, make me as one of your hired servants. There's the Greek word doulos, which refers to a slave. He doesn't use that word. There is the Greek word diakonos, which refers to like a household servant, like a butler. It's where our English word deacon comes from. And then there's this word that he uses, which is misthos, which is a skilled craftsman. In essence, what he says is, I'm going to go back to my father and I'm going to say, Dad, will you put me through trade school so that I can become a skilled craftsman? And I think what he's wanting to do is thinking that he can earn back enough money to buy his way back into his father's good graces. Don't we often do the same thing? You ever found yourself in a mess that you've made and you start bargaining with your father? Lord, if you'll get me out of this, I'll never miss another Sunday as long as I live. There was a guy on an airplane one time, and the plane started to go down, and the guy started praying. He said, Lord, if you'll get this plane on the ground safely, I'll give half of what I have to the church. The plane landed safely. As they were getting off, a guy tapped him on the shoulder and said, Sir, I couldn't help but hear your prayer a minute ago. And I'm a preacher. And I was going to give you an opportunity to make a contribution to the work that we're doing. He said, listen. I had another prayer on the way down, and we worked out a better deal. I told the Lord, if He'll get me out of this, I promise I'll never get on a plane again the rest of my life. That's us, isn't it? Lord, get me through this and I'll double my contribution. I'll never miss a Sunday. Lord, get me out of this and I promise I'll change my life. And then the next day, a lot of times those promises are often forgotten. See, what He's not expecting is that the Father, before He can even offer His plan to repay His debt, is going to make it clear, son, there is nothing to do to repay this debt. All has already been forgiven. The Father absorbs the loss. Isaiah 53 is going to say that God has laid upon Jesus the iniquity of us all. He absorbed all of it. We're going to have to stop for now. I want to make a suggestion to you. Go back home tonight, reread this story. See if there's anything that stands out to you that's a little bit different. And tomorrow night we'll pick up, we'll talk a little more about the father, and we'll talk a little more about the older brother. Thank y'all for your time.